by accident, which organs will the penny go through? What I'm really getting at here is, do you know which things are part of the tract, part of the where food actually goes in, as opposed to organs that are helping with digestion but are not necessarily part of the path that food is going through? So you should have number 1 on your list. Number 1 is your mouth, or if you want to be very scientific, your oral cavity. You should have number 2 on your list. It's your esophagus. That's how food gets from your mouth to your stomach. You should have number 4, which is your stomach, but not number 3. Number 3 is your liver. Food does not go in your liver. You should also not have number 5, which is your pancreas. Food does not go in your pancreas. Now, 6 is your large intestine, 7 is your small intestine, and 8 is the very end of your large intestine, which we'll see is the rectum at the end. So everything except for 3 and 5. So if we take a look at this, there are 6 things that should be on your list. We'll make this out of 3, 0.5 for each correct thing. If you put one that's not supposed to be there, take off 0.5. Now, would anyone like to ask any questions about any part of number 1? You'll notice I put a different picture on there on purpose. I want you to be able to recognize where a structure is and what its general shape is, perhaps what it's attached to, and not necessarily just memorize a spot on one particular diagram. And so I'll do my best to show you more than one version of each of the systems that we study so that you get a really good handle on where structures are. Number 2 is talking about my mouth, and I said that I wanted at least 2 things that happen in the mouth. I think there are a number of things that we could say is correct. First thing you might think of is ingestion. The mouth is supposed to be the point of ingestion. And if I had to pick something that would be the most affected by my mouth being injured, it would be ingestion, because normally no other organ accomplishes ingestion. Now, I didn't ask you to rank them here. I'm just letting you know that would be the number 1 thing. The next thing I would have on my list is physical digestion, because we know that our teeth accomplish quite a bit of physical digestion. I would also have chemical digestion. We know because saliva contains an enzyme called salivary amylase, some chemical digestion would not happen. Now, if I was ranking these, I would say the effect on physical digestion would be greater because your teeth accomplish a lot of physical digestion, where salivary amylase is just one small enzyme. It's still an effect. It's still correct here. Now, in terms of absorption, we could have that on the list. Although very little absorption happens in the mouth, there are only a few substances that could actually be absorbed. For example, water was one of them. So if I was ranking them, that's the order that I would put them in order of importance. If you have any 2 of those things, or a word that means one of those things, then you can have your 2 marks. Would anyone like to ask questions about number 2? So then number 3, if I had my canine teeth, your canine teeth are your vampire teeth, the long pointy ones. So if you had those teeth removed, the process that would be the most affected would be the idea of holding food in place. I would also accept cutting food. Now, your incisors, your front teeth, their main role is to cut food into smaller pieces. Your canine teeth have 2 things. They cut and they hold food. And since holding food is their function, not the function of your other teeth, I always put that one first. So this one will just be out of 1. You can have either or both of those things. Now, number 4 asks, why can I swallow when my head is upside down? So I would be looking for you to talk about the idea of peristalsis. Now, perhaps you didn't remember that specific word for today, but maybe you told me that it doesn't matter which way I am, muscles push food from my mouth to my stomach. So if you didn't say peristalsis, but you described what it is, you can still have the mark. So that makes this daily review out of 7. So this is the stomach sort of as a whole, the big picture of the stomach. What we're going to do now is take a look at one tiny section of the stomach. I said that you have a bunch of wrinkles in your stomach, and in the spaces in between these wrinkles, you have tons and tons of little glands that are producing substances that your stomach uses to help with chemical and physical digestion. So we are going to take a look, like I said, at one tiny little spot in the stomach. And if I were to expand what the inside of that wrinkle looked like, this is what I would get. What we're looking at here is called a gastric gland. So I'm going to highlight the beginning of the word, gastric. Words that sound like that are talking about your stomach. So you'll see that this is a gastric gland. We're going to make gastric lipase and a hormone called gastrin. There's a whole bunch of things that start with gast. We're talking about the stomach with all of them. Now a gastric gland, like it shows in this picture, and I'm going to make a really simplified version of it, is a little dip. It's a space in between the wrinkles in your stomach that is full of a bunch of different types of cells. Now there are names for all of the cells. I will not require that you can identify on a picture which cell is which. That's not the goal of this. I want you to recognize that there are different types of cells in the little folds inside your stomach that are called gastric glands. What is really important is that we know which substances are produced there. So I'm not going to ask you, for example, hey, what do the enterochromaffin-like cells produce? I might ask you, on a whole, which of these things come from a gastric gland, but not necessarily which one comes from which type of cell. So it's important for you to have a list of things that are produced. So thing 1, your stomach produces mucus. The mucus has a really important function. It protects the lining, the tissue, the inside of your stomach. It protects it from 2 things. It protects it from acid and from enzymes. If you didn't have mucus protecting the inside of your stomach produces enzymes, and those enzymes would start digesting your stomach. You don't have to know the cell types. You just need to know the substances secreted. And I'm not going to ask which substance comes from which cell. I'm going to ask as a whole, does this come from your gastric gland or not which cell inside. So like I was saying, your stomach produces enzymes that would start digesting the tissue of your stomach if you did not have mucus protecting it. And your stomach also has acid inside of it. Acid has a really low pH. Acids are corrosive. Acid would start eating away at your stomach if it wasn't protected. Now, if I lacked mucus, perhaps there was a bacteria that was infecting my gastric glands, or something was wrong with those particular cells, if I did not have enough mucus, I could get an ulcer. An ulcer is what happens when the acid or the enzymes in your stomach actually start eating away at it, and you get a little hole in your stomach. That's what an ulcer is. So the first thing is mucus. Mucus is there for protection. The second substance is our bicarbonate. Now, bicarbonate is a base. What do bases do? They counteract the action of acids. And so this is additional protection in your stomach against the acid. So the acid is there to help break down food and activate enzymes, but you really don't want your own stomach being digested. Now the next thing on the list is called gastric acid. Now, gastric acid is not the only name for this substance. We're calling it gastric acid because it is in your stomach. The actual substance is HCl. That's the chemical formula. HCl is technically called hydrochloric acid. And it's possible that you might see it referred to as hydrochloric acid instead of gastric acid because it's a little more specific. Now, what do we need this acid for? Well, the idea is that we want a low pH. Now, a couple of steps later, I'm going to talk about the enzymes that are in your stomach. And you might remember learning in the very first section that some enzymes have an optimum pH that's very low. Some enzymes have an optimum pH that is very high. So the reason we have this acid, in large part, is so that a particular enzyme that's going to digest proteins can be functional. So I'm going to jump down here and talk about pepsin because it kind of goes together with acid. You'll see the way it's written there. It says pepsin, and then there's brackets, and inside the brackets it says ogen. The idea is this. The substance starts out as pepsinogen. When you add acid, I activate that pepsinogen and it becomes pepsin. So that's why we need the acid. The acid helps activate pepsinogen, helps it become pepsin, and pepsin is the active enzyme. Pepsinogen is not active. It's not actually doing the enzyme function. It's still a similar substance, but it's like we've turned it off. Adding HCl turns it on, gives us pepsin, which is our active enzyme. Now, what does pepsin do? It takes proteins and makes polypeptides out of them. So when we talked about proteins way back at the beginning, I would have mentioned that anytime you have pep in a word, it refers to proteins. And so that's how you could remember that pepsin or pepsinogen are enzymes that are affecting proteins because they start with that same prefix. A polypeptide, so poly means many or several, more than one. A polypeptide is a chain of amino acids, more than just a couple of them, but not an entire protein. So what we're saying is that pepsin takes whole proteins and starts breaking them into smaller pieces. We don't have individual amino acids here yet. That will happen later. But we're taking our large protein and making polypeptides out of it. Now, there are some other substances that are produced in your stomach. I'm going to mention gastric lipase next. Gastric lipase is another enzyme. How do I know it's an enzyme? It ends with ASE, and lots of enzymes do. You'll notice that pepsin is actually one of the exceptions. It doesn't end with ASE. Now, the gastric part means that it's in the stomach. Lipase is an enzyme that affects lipids. So its name is giving you a clue as to its function. Now there are a few other substances that are also produced in your gastric glands. There's a substance just called the intrinsic factor that helps with calcium absorption. And we know why calcium is so important for muscles, at least. We require calcium so that muscle contraction can occur. Then there are two substances, histamine and gastrin, that help with the production of acid. And then finally, there's another substance, somatostatin, that will inhibit acid. So you have some internal controls in your stomach giving a signal to produce more or less acid depending on what food is being consumed or what the state of the person's body is. So these are gastric glands. You would need to know what are the substances that come from these glands and what is their function digestively. Would anyone like to ask any questions about any of the substances? So if you happen to have printed out notes, you would notice that the very next slide is all that stuff that I just said. And then there's one last line that I'd like to highlight here. Once food has mixed with all of these digestive fluids that are in your stomach, we don't call it food anymore. We call it chyme, C-H-Y-M-E. It looks like chime, but spelt wrong. But chyme is how you pronounce it. So this is just a vocabulary word that you will very likely see used when we're referring to what leaves the stomach and what is entering your small intestine. So your small intestine has two major functions. The first one is chemical digestion, and I'm highlighting the word complete. Your small intestine is supposed to complete the chemical digestion of all of the macronutrients or macromolecules. And so once food leaves your small intestine, no more digestion is happening. The second function is to absorb. And this is the number one place that things are absorbed. It's true that small amounts of absorption can happen in your mouth or in your stomach, but most of the absorption happens in the small intestine. And the idea with absorption is that we get whatever we ate into our bloodstream. So it has to be a small enough molecule that it can get across the wall of a blood vessel. So digestion has to happen so that absorption can occur as well. Now there are three sections to your small intestine. The first part, and you'll notice I gave a pretty wide range of measurements because it depends how big of a person you are, but the first section of your small intestine is called the duodenum. And that's the part that we'll end up talking about the most. The second and third parts are called the jejunum and the ileum, and that's in order. So after the stomach, the first piece of your small intestine is the duodenum, then the jejunum, then the ileum. After the ileum, we would be moving on to the large intestine, which can also be called the colon. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that are important about the duodenum. The duodenum is the very beginning of your small intestine, and this is the meeting place for a lot of substances. This is where chyme, which is what we're calling the food sloshy mixture that's coming out of your stomach, this is where chyme meets the common bile duct. And that's a pretty important point. The common bile duct is the tube that is attached to your gallbladder, your liver, and your pancreas. Now, since your gallbladder, your liver, and your pancreas are not actually having food enter into them, this point is really important because for their secretions to have any effect on digestion, it has to meet up with your food. So if for some reason your duodenum was blocked or broken or injured, or the common bile duct was blocked or broken or injured, you would not be able to digest a lot of food because so far all that's happened is your teeth have broken it down, you have a little bit of amylase in your saliva, you have that pepsin in your stomach. Most of the enzymes that are going to help digest your food haven't actually touched it yet. That's going to happen right here in the duodenum. Does anyone want to ask any questions about the setup of your small intestine? So the picture I have here is one of the better ones. It's fairly realistic looking. One of the things I want to point out about intestines in general is that there is a lot of what we call connective tissue. And you'll see this when we go to do our fetal pig dissection. If you would like to look at how long intestines are, you'll actually have to pull apart this connective tissue. The intestines are held together purposefully so that they don't slosh around inside of you. But there's a lot of tissue holding them together in the sort of folded up configuration that they're in. So this is the small intestine's setup, anatomy. What we also need to talk about is some details about what the internal surface of your small intestine looks like. So I have some information here, and then I have a very nice looking picture on the next slide that I'll show you. I'm going to draw a crude version here so that you could try drawing it with me. When we look at the surface of the small intestine, what we notice is that specifically there is a lot of area, mathematical area, length times width. And there are three things that are special about the surface area, the inside of your small intestine, that help it enhance absorption. So if I were to ask you on a quest, why is your small intestine the place where absorption happens, these are the things that you're going to tell me about. So thing number one that you would want to talk about is that there are wrinkles. So if I were to draw what the inside of your small intestine looks like, it's not flat. It's kind of wavy. And because of that, because it's wavy and not just flat, I end up getting a little bit more surface in the same width because I've made a wavy line instead of a straight line. Imagine that you took that wavy line and stretched it out. It would actually be longer. Those wrinkles give 3 times more surface than if your intestines were just a flat, straight tube. Now, the next thing that your intestines have are millions, I'm not going to draw millions, I'm going to draw like a few, of finger-like projections. They really do look like creepy little fingers. On the video I showed you of the woman eating the noodles and the tomato, they looked white. I thought they kind of looked like anemone at the bottom of the ocean floor, but that's what they look like, things waving away. So it has a bunch of these projections. And these projections go all across the surface of your small intestine. These projections are called villi. If you want the singular, it is a villus. Now, because of these finger-like projections, I'm getting not only the extra surface area from my wavy intestine, but now I'm getting these really big waves. This is going to give me 10 times more surface area than if I had a flat, smooth intestine that had no bumps and no wrinkles and no villi. Now, inside the villi is where you find blood vessels. Whoops, that's not red. So what you'll see, and this is just a very crude representation, is that for food to get into your blood, it has to go through the villi because that is where the blood vessels are. Now, when we get to chapter 8, we'll talk about how there's different types of blood vessels. I'm going to be very generic for now. But there are blood vessels. And we know that the end products of digestion have to get into our blood. And it's across the lining of the villi that absorption actually happens. It could be by diffusion. It could be active transport. Diffusion is something that is passive. It happens because of higher concentration on one side. Active transport is something that your body uses energy for, and we'll talk a little bit more about both of those processes when we get to the section on excretion, because that's where we really get into some details. Now, that's not the end. There is still one more thing. The lining of the villi, so the surface of the villi, has many little wrinkles called microvilli. So I'm just going to draw one, but the idea would be that each of those finger-like projections has what ends up looking like little hairs on it. If you were to look at a picture of it, it looks like a finger with a bunch of hairs on it. So these are the microvilli, and there are so many of those that they give 20 times more surface than if your intestine was a long, flat, straight tube. So if I add all of these things up, 3 times 10 times 20, that's 600 times more surface area than if my intestine was just flat. So wrinkles, villi, microvilli. Those are the three things that are making the surface area of your small intestine the prime location for absorption. And absorption happens because there are blood vessels inside each of those villi. Now, would anyone like to ask any questions at all about the inside of your small intestine? So if you would like, there's a picture in your textbook of this same thing showing a much better artist's representation of this. Like with anything, I would not expect you to draw something, but if you ever wanted to, you could draw something similar to what I did here, making sure to label it. I color-coded mine. The green things are wrinkles, blue are the villi, black are the microvilli, red are the blood vessels. That would be enough of labeling for me to know what your diagram was of. So this picture is showing just the same thing. Here's your small intestine in its location. If we're to increase it in size and take just a small chunk of it, it's illustrating once again that there are muscles. So in every organ in your digestive system, there are muscles. There are muscles in your mouth, in your esophagus, in your stomach, and again in your small intestine. So smooth muscles are continuously pushing food along. Then you'll see here that we enlarged and then enlarged again so that you could see how there were finger-like projections, and in each of those projections there were blood vessels going in and out to carry the products of digestion. Now, the last thing about your small intestine that we would have to discuss is the digestion that's happening there. There are enzymes produced by your small intestine. So far we know about salivary amylase that comes from your saliva, your salivary glands. We know about pepsin that comes from a gastric gland. Now we're going to learn about a few more enzymes made by the cells that line the villi. So if this is a picture of villi with microvilli on the surface of it, there's spots down here in between each of the villi. Now there are anatomical words for all of these things. Technically, they're called crypts because they're down at the bottom. But that's where these things are coming from. There are cells in between each of the projections. Now, because all of the projections, the villi, kind of look like, let's say, a brush, a hairbrush, these enzymes are called brush border enzymes. So that's where they're coming from, the spaces in between the villi. The villi kind of look like the bristles on a hairbrush, so we're calling them brush border enzymes. And these are the enzymes that you need to know. First, maltase. Now its name is telling you exactly what it's doing. Maltase is taking maltose, which is a disaccharide, and breaking it down into two monosaccharides. So that is maltase's job. It is an enzyme, I know that because it ends with ASE. And maltase is affecting maltose. It takes maltose and breaks it down. So we learned in our first chapter already what the disaccharides are and what the two monosaccharides that make them up are called. And so that's going to be useful information for you here. Sucrase is the second one. Sucrase will take sucrose and break it down into glucose and fructose. Next, you have lactase. Lactase will take lactose and break it down into glucose and galactose. And lastly, peptidase. Now, we just reminded ourselves that when words start with pep, it means protein. And I told you that in the stomach, proteins are broken down into peptides. So now I have peptidase that is taking a peptide and breaking it down into amino acids, which are the small building blocks of proteins. So we've actually seen now an enzyme for each of the three macromolecules that we discussed. There was an enzyme in your mouth for large polysaccharides. There's these enzymes in your intestine for disaccharides. There's an enzyme in your stomach and in your intestine for proteins. And then there was a little bit of lipase in your stomach for fats. Would anyone like to ask any questions about the enzymes of the small intestine? We're going to finish today by talking about your large intestine, and then you're going to have some time to work on things. Your large intestine, much like your small intestine, has 3 segments. Now the segments are called the something colon, and so I want to remind you that your large intestine is often referred to as your colon. So a colonoscopy is when they are investigating your colon if you've ever heard someone talk about it, the basic idea is that they put a camera inside of your colon. How would they get a camera inside of your colon? Well, the easiest way is to come in through the bottom. That's a colonoscopy. Yes, yes. So there are 3 segments to your large intestine, and we labeled them already, but I want to remind you: ascending, transverse, and descending colon. And like I mentioned the other day, it references the direction that food is moving. So your ascending colon is on the left of the picture. Food goes up. Transverse colon is in the middle, it's going across. And the descending colon is on the right. Now, if you were to try to find your own personal ascending, transverse, and descending colon, what you should remember is that on anatomical pictures, and now it's actually starting to make a difference, the image is always reversed. So if you look at a picture, and on a picture it looks like it's on the left, that means it's actually on your right side. So if you wanted to find your ascending colon, it's on the right side of you. When you look at a picture, it's the left side of the picture. So those are the 3 segments. At the end of your colon, you have the rectum. The rectum is there for storage of feces. And to determine whether or not feces exits your body, the rectum terminates with the anus, which has circular muscles that allow or don't allow feces to pass. Now, there are a couple of other sections or parts that are attached to your large intestine. First of all, the ileocacal valve. Now, this valve, if you look at its name, is telling you what it's attaching. Ileo refers to the ileum, which is the last section of your small intestine. And cacal here refers to the cecum, which is the pouch right at the beginning of your large intestine. So the ileocacal valve is attaching your ileum and your cecum together. Now, what's the cecum? It is the pouch at the beginning of the colon. So as food is exiting your small intestine, this is where it collects. And then you'll notice a little dangler right at the beginning of your intestine, your large intestine. We have the appendix, an organ with, as far as we can tell, no digestive function. It might have something to do with bacteria that help your large intestine. You can survive without your appendix, and it does not have an official function that is helping you digest food. But your appendix, well, I colored right over top of it, is this tiny little pouch right at the beginning of the colon. It's normally very small. Sometimes the appendix can become infected and become very large. It could possibly even rupture. And those are the scenarios where you'd have to have your appendix removed. So this is what your large intestine is made of. A bunch of different pieces attached in different places. Now, what does your large intestine do? So before I go there, does anyone have any questions about the anatomy of your large intestine? So then this is the last page that we'll talk about today. Your large intestine is not involved with physical or chemical digestion. That is not what is happening. What is its major purpose? to reabsorb water. So the function of your large intestine, for the most part, is to take back water from the mixture of food and enzymes that has moved from your mouth through your esophagus, your stomach, and your small intestine, and to put it back into your blood. Your body is pretty good at keeping water around. You are made up mostly of water. And if your body can afford it, it will not let water go. Now, that doesn't mean that it reabsorbs all the water, because if it did, you would have what this picture is illustrating here, constipation, where the waste product cannot get out of your large intestine. And so we don't want to reabsorb all the water. We just want to reabsorb most of the water. So how do we ensure that there's the right amount of water? You need fiber. Fiber is loosely defined as the undigestible portion of plant material. Specifically cellulose, it's found in the cell wall of most plants. So the cell wall is the thing that makes plant cells look rectangular as opposed to round animal cells. We don't have enzymes to digest that particular substance. And fiber helps hold on to water. Now, if you have a low fiber diet, you will probably suffer from chronic constipation. Just because we're on the topic, the opposite problem would be diarrhea. Diarrhea is when you have too much water in your feces, so not enough water is being reabsorbed. There are also in your large intestines a large amount of bacteria. So if you have watched TV commercials and heard people talk about probiotics and how you should eat them and you need them and you didn't really know what they are, here is a place. A probiotic is usually some sort of healthy bacteria that you need in your intestinal lining to help keep you healthy. Now, the bacteria do a lot of things. One of the things they do is produce vitamin K.